So we're very excited to have Jordan speaking tonight. He's going to talk about his work at the demo lab over at Brandeis. As you all found out, we have a new venue. Hopefully this will work out in the future. They're kind enough here to waive the fee requirement for the room, but certainly ordering food and drink is encouraged. So hopefully we'll meet here for some time to come, but that's still in the air. Next month, we're going to have a Valentine's Day themed presentation focusing on why evolution developed, I guess you could say, sexual reproduction. So the details on that will be coming in the next few weeks. So, and with that introduction, we're extremely excited to have Jordan speaking.
Thanks. I got this thing, I've been to 3 of these now and I can never hear anybody, so I spotted this thing for $60 on eBay and I thought I'd get it. I don't actually need it though, so, but you know, sometimes you buy a piece of technology, you got to use it just because you got it, right? So, what am I doing here? I'm giving the, just sort of an update, some background on the problem that I work on, people that I work with. I've had a lot of students and a few postdocs. Right now the lab is very small. It's, I just have about 2 students now. But the big problem, that I came from the field of AI, and I left the field because I determined that the problem was that the programs that people could write were 3 orders of magnitude smaller than the basic systems of nature that made living systems. We were writing, the biggest codes we could write were 10 million lines of code, and when you look at something like an ecosystem or a brain or a mind or an immune system, food chain, species, anything you look at in nature, it just looks like it's billions and billions of lines of code to describe.
Even a worm?
Even a worm.
Where you can count the 987 cells over there?
Well, I'll get to that at some point. It's sort of, it has to do with how much intelligence was involved in its selection is something that increases the complexity of an object as well. So when you
10 million lines of C are about 10 lines of this.
APL. Now, so I started saying, well, how do we get a 10 billion line program? Okay, and I ended up in working in evolution, but not in evolution as an optimization. Let's solve this problem, but evolution is, and how can we replicate the growth and complexity that we've seen in nature. So the biggest software, like I said, has 10 to 100 million lines of code. If it's bigger, it has like flapping icons, you know, like Microsoft Windows is just DOS with some flapping icons when you move a file. And Space Shuttle has on the order of 250,000 to 500,000 parts. Now RAM, of course, can have 10 billion bits, but in software that's just 2 lines of code. It's just a do loop. Okay. So hardware progress in terms of making bigger and bigger memories or replicated CPUs, when you look at it from a software complexity point of view, is not getting that much more complicated. So in fact what happens is, having been in software for many, many years, you start doing a bigger and bigger project, you bring more and more people on, and the people start creating problems for each other, even though they think they're fixing something, they're breaking it for somebody else. And then you impose management and computer-aided software engineering, okay, and that slows everything down. And then you get customers that want it to stay the same way. That slows it down, okay. And eventually what happens is, as you get up to 100 million lines of code, all your time is spent in fixing and debugging it. And so you can't actually get it any larger, conceptually speaking, in terms of the complexity of the code. So I started working on how does this work in nature? How do we have these systems without any brains, without any people, without any intelligent designers, come out of this seemingly random chemical process?
I have one quick question for you. You talk about the complexity of it being 100,000 lines of code, but that depends very much on what computer language you're using. If you're programming in machine code, it's very different than if you're programming in.
Right, well there are these things called software metrics and various ways of measuring it. Okay.
It's like
It's sort of like,
you can have more complex systems if you have a language.
Right, but if you had a basic language that could write a subroutine, then you could still essentially compile out those differences. Okay, maybe there'll be a polynomial difference between one ultimate machine and another. So we started looking at evolution in terms of how do you create an open-ended. Here's really the big question, which still isn't answered. How do you create an open-ended evolutionary process on a computational universal substrate, such that the result of wasting more and more computer time is a bigger and bigger and more complex computer program? Okay, and that in some sense I realize that that's isomorphic to the AI problem. How do you build a computer program that would be as smart as a person? Okay, it's the same question, only it comes at it from a different set of tools and a different set of measurements. We don't have to measure how much natural language is doing, okay, or how well it drives a car. We have to measure how well the system is capable of building more complex parts, building on top of each other, okay, and generating more specific kinds of complexity. Now, we started focusing on coevolution very early because in looking around at nature, that seemed to be, when you looked at, say, the peacock's tail or the human brain or the mammalian penis, it always seemed to be some kind of an arms race, either sexual selection or interspecies, which would lead to the development of more and more extreme measurable elements in biological systems. Now, technically in nature, coevolution just means that you have two species and they have some features that are contingent that could not have evolved without them being in proximity to the other species. But in machine learning, when we talk about coevolution, most people know it's about how do we get an arms race going? How do you sort of get something for nothing out of machine learning? You start with a small process, and by dissipating energy in the form of computer cycles, you get something more and more complex. And it's not impossible to think about trading computer cycles for knowledge, right? Because in some sense, that's what deeper and deeper apply search does in a simple thing like a chess player. You throw in more computer time, the same chess player, the same program gets better at playing chess. So there's this net increase of knowledge that comes from the dissipation of computing energy. And the question is, can we capture that? That sort of nonlinear, iterative, and yet historically sticky, this sort of building process that we see in nature where something's learned, it's kept, something's learned on top of it. We have abstraction, modularity, all this kind of stuff. We don't really fully know how to do it. But work on the basic model has proven quite productive. So the way to think about it, can you guys hear me? I hear them. So imagine, so the way that this is set up is evolution is a group of people, say, playing poker. Okay. Oh, well, on the internet, no one knows if you're a dog, right? So you're playing poker, right? And all you get is the rules, and you start playing, and everyone's essentially making random moves, figuring out which cards to hold and which to throw. And then some guy figures out good heuristics for which cards to hold, and he starts winning the money. Okay? And then the next guy figures out, well, in order to do better than him, I have to invent probability and statistics to do a really good analysis of what, get the edge over a guy who just has heuristics. Okay? And then the next guy has an amazing breakthrough, the deceptive breakthrough, figures out how to bluff. Because before that, people would smile big when they had a good hand. Okay? Because it was thought it was all luck and it didn't really matter. And then people who learned the bluff started winning more, and then of course the next guy invented the tell. And what you get is this ratcheting process of better and better strategies of playing the game. So we can look at evolution in the biosphere essentially as a game of survival, where the different species are different strategies, and in their interaction, predator-prey interactions, niche replacement interactions, symbiotic interactions and so forth, that somehow it's driven the set of species on Earth into more and more complex body plans. And that's really what we'd like to understand theoretically and replicate with software. So the canonical, sort of the basic coevolutionary algorithm, and it was done originally by, the earliest person that usually gets credit for this is Danny Hillis, but it was actually done a little bit earlier in the 50s, according to David Fogel's book. You have a population, like in a GA. You evaluate the members, and if you're done, you output your fittest individual. Otherwise, you do some crossover and mutation, you get a new generation. Now, in the evaluation of members in coevolution isn't to an external fitness function. It's not like, okay, here's my definition of what a good car is, how close is it to the color blue, how long is the wheelbase minus the weight. It's essentially in the game you play the players, the members of the population against each other in the game, and through something like survival of the fittest, hopefully the ones that learn how to bluff will pop out.
Are you doing both survival of the fittest and sexual selection? Or
There are different models that sometimes use diploidy and try to get that effect. And there are ones that use multiple species. You could also do coevolution inside a single species, which is sort of like from machine learning you can do coevolution inside a single species. Right? In nature it's always defined as that contingent. Okay? So in some sense sexual selection is a form of coevolution within species, but it's defined as a different word. Okay? I don't know if that answers the question. So I started working on this in the early 90s, and we did research on where the successes were and what had been done. And mainly it was things like Prisoner's Dilemma or Pursuer Evader, like little differential games that had been studied in the Navy in the 60s. Games like tic-tac-toe, backgammon, checkers, work on finding the rules for cellular automata that Stephen Wolfram found by hand, and robotics. And so I had a set of students, and we were working on trying to understand what works and what doesn't, and why. So just to show you a couple of successes, we started doing evolution of robots inside virtual reality. So inside like video game dynamics, and then constrained the robots so that they could be built with some automatic manufacturing tools, which could be a human hand, for example, we could define as the factory. Okay, and this led to some great successes. In fact, been doing this now for almost a decade, and we've done about 5 generations, though really the second one was the one that was the most famous. But we started with working with Legos and evolving in a simulated Lego world what structures would stand. And then we moved it to a static civil engineering model called trusses, but it wasn't a dynamic simulation, it was essentially an iterated static simulation of truss structures like on a roof or a bridge, and the forces involved as different beams change length under motor control. To get more complex, we worked using L systems instead of direct evolution. We worked on turning that into a modular form of robotic instruction, and then started working on a deeper problem, which is as the robots got more complex, it became harder and harder to imagine manufacturing systems for them. So we were essentially limited taking simulations out into the real world by how hard it was to manufacture. So we started working on the evolution of manufacture itself. And so there's the original Lego structure. It involved a triangle to go up and carry a weighted 45 degrees. There's one of the Golem robots on the top right. The L system robots, which I also had on my first slide in simulation, okay, are down on the bottom right. And there's another one which is not in AVI format. So
What is the one at the bottom right?
So the one on the bottom right is out of John Rieffel's dissertation. So there's a random sort of building process that is essentially measured at the end after it stacks a bunch of blocks, okay, and then certain blocks evaporate and other blocks fuse, okay, and so it's kind of like the interaction between construction and physics. So as you're building something, what the world does to the building in the middle actually has an effect on what you can build. Okay, so that was the evolution of an umbrella shape this emerged from the simulation. It essentially built something, and then it built something. Hang on a second. It built something, and then with the freezing process and the evaporation process, one part fell over the other. That was done inside of ODE, which is now fairly in wide use. And let's see if did QuickTime come up? Yeah. So this machine was built using a set of modules that we had built, and it turned out to be very fragile out of the plastic that came out of our 3D printing machine. So this robot survived long enough for its video, and then it blew itself up. Okay. But basically that was the 4th generation. And so we've been working on this, and this is an application of coevolution from my perspective, even though somehow people think of me as a roboticist for some reason. So, and of course, you know, if you're working on robots that can design and build other robots, it scares the hell out of people, and you know, no one really wants self-reproducing robots. It's verboten like stem cell research. Now, another thing that we had, which was a fairly early success, was that the best backgammon player in the world was done by Jerry Tazawa at IBM using temporal difference reinforcement learning on a neural network, and it's called TD Gammon. And in 1992 and 1995, he showed how this program, playing itself backgammon, could essentially become the best player in the world. And I was like, that shouldn't work. That's like a GA with a population of 2. I mean, you know, if it had a big population, maybe something else must be going on. So we essentially tried to replicate this with hill climbing, and we did. We got a legal backgammon move generator, which turns out to be a complex little piece of code, from a friend, and then started running hill climbing on some fairly simple neural networks that would be the evaluation function. And it actually worked. It learned for a while, and then it got stuck. And you could make little tweaks to the algorithm and get it to learn a little more. But the amazing thing was that it worked at all, from my perspective. Why should hill climbing work on such a hard problem like backgammon? It had to be something about the coevolutionary structure of the task, that as you're learning, the thing that you're learning against, the teacher, so to speak, is getting better and better because it's you, which is a kind of coevolution. So this is the best example of learning through self-play. But there's also other elements of backgammon that are like life itself, okay, which is that unlike chess, say, a weak player can beat a strong player just on luck, okay? So you don't get a sort of winner-take-all monopoly, and you can't really forget how to play, because if you forget how to do things like cover your points, the other player can take advantage of it. So it has a sort of history-preserving mechanism as you learn the strategy, and it's unstable. There's a sort of reversibility going on in the game when you're winning and then you're losing and then you're winning and then you're losing, and you could learn in all different phases of the game instead of learning the opening or learning the end game. Okay, first.
Talks about a number of reasons why.
Right, and I think he was wrong. I mean, he talked about you know, just the stochastic.
Is that the randomness of backgammon smooths out the frequency. But you can get, you know, from one state you end up in many different states, and
Right.
This makes reinforcement learning work well.
It makes it work well, and it's also the fact that he had his representation, which essentially was a similarity-based representation of backgammon positions too, right? You know, so it was sort of like 1 piece, 2 piece, or 3 or more, I think, you know, for every point. So there were a few different reasons, but I was trying to figure out why it worked, because it just didn't seem really possible. Now it turns out, and I'll talk to you later about this, it works because of a 1957 paper by Bellman, and there was also no draw in backgammon. Now, besides backgammon and all these other tests that we did, we found generally we can get a successful paper, we can get something done, but somehow the systems would figure out a way of stopping on their own. We started calling it mediocre stable states. So the system would sort of make some progress, and then one guy would take over and wipe everybody else out, and it would hit a fixed point. Okay? Or there'd be 2 different species in, say, some kind of a prisoner's dilemma, and those 2 species helped each other and excluded everybody else. So they couldn't invade a new, even if it was a more innovative strategy, they couldn't invade, like Toyota couldn't invade the car market in the United States for many years, right? So we had GM and Ford and Chrysler. We call that a collusive oligarchy, okay, right? And then we had games sort of disengagement where there was no learning taking place because different parts of the system weren't even capable of talking to each other. We had systems that seemed to be improving, and then they would head into a death spiral, like from kamikazes. Okay, and it's like, what's going on? Why is the coevolutionary dynamics so complicated? And so we figured there was some sort of a bug in our reasoning, in our great hope that if you set up self-play in a game with a competitive structure like an evolutionary structure, competition for the niche, that should lead to an arms race under the right circumstances. Well, it turns out that in almost all competitive systems have some kind of mixed strategy, which is a Nash equilibrium, which can figure out how the competitors themselves can figure out, without actually talking to each other, what a good strategy is that they don't have to move from. So I realized that there's something missing Darwin didn't get, which is something in evolution is overcoming the Nash equilibria in a regular way. Now, it could be meteor strikes, it could be the hand of God, it could be climate. We don't know what it is, but something prevented biology from hitting a Nash equilibrium at bacteria, okay, and stopping. Okay, and I figured if I find that, I would go down in history, for other guys who thought they could find a principle, whether it's communism or drugs, They all have beards. They look like me, I thought. So is there a principle of progress, right? That's sort of an underlying question. Now, so some of the recent theory in the lab that we've done working on why do we get these mediocre stable states, why do these systems have the death spirals and the oligarchies arise and so forth. There's a bunch of different stuff that's come out of the students that I'm just going to survey in the little time I have left, and then tell you a little bit about the new application we're doing besides robotics that came out of the work. So I'm going to show you some fairly simple simulations, okay, in MATLAB, I think. But first I want to tell you about the game. So very simple coevolutionary algorithm, say with one population of 2, everyone plays everybody else, and you sum up the fitness of your interaction of all the other players. You get some sort of proportional reproduction, okay, but there's no sex here, there's no crossover, there's just a sort of a Gaussian mutation. And then one of the parameters that we could twist, sort of like a knob in a chaos experiment, is, how bad your children are. Okay, so if we put that knob at 0, your children are equally distributed better than you and worse than you. But as we turn that knob up to 1, most of your kids are at a standard deviation of 1 worse than you in the game. So only a few of your children technically should be better, and that makes it a much harder problem. So let's see, where is the? It seems like I'm missing a slide. Hang on a second. Is it gone? Okay. Well, what happened to those slides?
Perhaps one of the robots that can replicate itself.
Yeah.
Very weird. I think it somehow it just jumped right over it.
Maybe it's hidden.
Is there such a way of hiding?
Yeah. If you have some slides that you don't want to delete, but you don't want to present either, you can hide them.
Oh yeah, you can mark slides.
Okay. Say again?
There is a way to hide slides in PowerPoint, but it'll show up in the editing page.
That's very weird. That hadn't happened to me before. So anyway, so Richard Watson invented this simple game. It's not even a game. Oh. You don't have it. It showed up on my screen.
There we go. It's like, come on. There we go.
There.
Okay. Now, the numbers game, has anyone come across that in their own research? Yes, okay. So it's sort of even simpler than the prisoner's dilemma, much simpler than backgammon. There's no game at all. You just take 2 points on the Euclidean plane, x1, y1, and x2, y2. And the way they play each other is that the one which is higher in the closer dimension, you compare x1 to x2, y1 to y2, and whichever difference is smaller, which player has a higher value along that dimension wins the game. Okay? Is there a question? No. So in this case, okay, they're closer in the y dimension, these 2 points. So the guy on the left should win. Is this going to jump all the way again? No. Okay. So the smaller dimension is y. Okay, it's 6 rather than 10. Now, which dimension are they greater than? They're greater. This guy is greater in the y dimension. And in fact, if the absolute fitness, which we don't know, because only God knows that in this game, which is the sum of x plus y, is pointing straight up to the right, then when you look around a particular point, because of the loss of knowledge that you have in coevolution, because you're just comparing players, you don't have an absolute yardstick, you can start moving in the wrong direction. So any of the green areas are actually, any point in any of the green areas are actually better than that point in the middle, but only the ones going up to the right are actually absolutely better, only the algorithm doesn't know where it is. Yeah.
So this x plus y, is that just the observer looking at it?
Yeah, it's sort of like it's the observer looking in. So we're looking at it, we're saying, you know, what's happening in this coevolution, but the algorithm itself is lacking that information.
Okay, it's not even in the fitness.
Yeah, it's not. The fitness function is compare on smaller dimension. Okay, so this leads to a lot of intransitive superiority cycles, like A is better than B, B is better than C, and C is better than A, like rock, scissors, papers. And these we found earlier to be very confusing to coevolution because you're comparing things together, and instead of everything getting better, sometimes you'll have a worse player beat someone who's absolutely a better player, and that will reset your population's fitness back. So simple simulation using, I can do with 1 or 2 populations. Basically, I just have points in x and y, and they play all against all, and you sum up who wins and who loses, and then you essentially use a proportional reproduction with some mutation. Okay, so it's a very simple algorithm. I think I actually have the MATLAB, if anyone reads MATLAB, right there. I'm not going to give you time to read the MATLAB. Sorry. So let's see. So here's the MATLAB command window. There's MATLAB fitness, and then if I do, I always make it so that I can just type. Hopefully I can type 4 letters without making a mistake. So here is a population, I think, of 100. The points, again, they start clustered around 0. And as you see, they're all sort of moving up to the right, which is good. They're evolving, they're driving each other to learn. There's no absolute fitness in the system, and yet the effect of the coevolution is to lead to a growing fitness. And that curve is the average absolute fitness across the population over time. So we take the 100 units, we add up x and y, okay, we average across all of them, and you can see that this met the old hope for coevolution. But this has no negative bias. So in other words, your children are just as likely to be better than you than worse than you. And imagine a task that's a little bit harder, you know, like survival. Okay, you would work that with some negative bias, which means that whenever you reproduce, there's a greater chance of you sort of sliding back downhill. Right? Throw your children up in the air, but if you run a hill, a lot of them land lower than you. Okay. So here we start to see some of the negative behaviors of coevolution that people have noticed. You know, it seems like it's okay, but then it just starts heading off in the wrong direction. And again, there's no yardstick, right? It's all done with relative fitness, so the system itself doesn't know what direction it's heading in. Okay. I can deal with 2 populations, which sometimes makes it a little clearer. Here, all the reds play all the blues. Okay. And so this is sort of like a battle between 2 species, which we normally think of as happening. And you can see they sort of climb for a while. You get wins and losses, fairly complex structure. And I think I could turn off the dots. And now what you can just see is a whole bunch of different runs. These are all with 0.3 bias. Sometimes you win. Okay. Sometimes you get disengagement. Okay. Sometimes you get death spirals. You get booms and busts. Okay. Say again?
If you had a larger sample, would it be smoother, or would you still see the kind of
I've run this from like 20 up to 300 or 400. I don't know what it would be at thousands. Okay. But basically, it should behave pretty much the same way, subject to the change of certain parameters. So maybe that you need more noise in a larger system. Like if you have greater populations, that could be. You could think of if you could achieve zero at a certain negative bias, that could be something like the strength of the algorithm that you're working with. And so a stronger algorithm will go uphill with more negative bias. Yeah.
Well, I mean, there were also studies with infinite populations that showed that you can have problematic
Right.
behaviors.
Exactly.
So,
Yeah, just purely math models.
yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So then I want to tell you. So we started working on this. I think. Let's see if I can go back to the other. So what we saw happening is that essentially the population was going to different extremes. And the idea is that we started saying, well, why are we summing up all your games? Everyone plays everybody else, and then we sum your wins, and that's your fitness. Maybe there's something wrong with that. Maybe that purely competitive structure isn't giving us enough information, isn't keeping the population flexible enough. Sometimes you'll get a mediocre player that beats everybody else, and you'll get what they used to call premature convergence, which was a symptom of some GAs in the early days, I guess. Now, so what we started looking at is, well, maybe all the other players are different objectives. So you want to beat all the other players that you can, but you don't want to do it just by summing up your score. You essentially want to look and say, well, which players do I win? And then the idea there is that you keep, instead of a fixed population of a certain size, yeah.
But then with that many dimensions, everything's on the product. The only way to beat someone is to better them against every single other player as possible.
Right, so you probably don't do a fully mixed strategy at that point. Right? It's sort of a sampling of, you're finding information out about these other players. So that tends to make, I think, the next one, if I'm right, this should be a Pareto demonstration, but maybe it's not going up. It ran off the screen. Okay. So this is with a 0.25 bias. Okay. And then no, I'm sorry. It's all negative. It's all negative bias. It's all negative. So the Pareto version, which essentially protects, and this is related to early work by my student Xu Zhui, the Pareto stuff is essentially protecting minority elements in the population that help discriminate among the other players. And so what we think of as a learning signal is essentially remaining around longer, whereas if you have purely proportional reproduction, you can kill off the messenger, you can kill off the teacher, so that the population doesn't really have any more direction. So that's one, there's a set of papers on that, and that led us to think about what we call informativeness. So imagine that we had a set of chess players and everyone played each other a game, okay, or a set of games, and then we got the score. Now the competitiveness would be essentially the sum across the row. So say the chess master beats everybody on the top row, okay, and if you sum across the row, then you would have, the top one would have a value of 4, right? And the loser would have a value of 0. Okay, and this would have a 3, 1, 2, and that would be competitiveness. It would just be the sum. But the idea of informativeness is that the chess master and the total loser, okay, provide no information at all about the rest of the population. So if you think about informativeness as the Kolmogorov complexity of one line of this matrix, how much, how big a program does it take to reconstruct? How much information is in there about the state of the population? This essentially tells you nothing, and this tells you nothing. Okay, this tells you very little that you don't know from that guy, right? But these guys each tell you, okay, they tell you that there's some difference between player 4 and player 5 that can be exploited, and there's some difference between player 2 and player 3 that can be exploited. So if you look at pure competitiveness and just add it up, you're throwing away the information that is useful to help drive the population. Okay, and this is like some recent work by Anthony Bucci, who hasn't given me any of his slides, so I can't include it in my talk. But on essentially a geometric model where you can essentially extract from the interactions, you can extract something like principal components of the underlying problem to help figure out which direction the competitions will drive development in. So I started worrying more about this informativeness competitiveness structure and saying, well, that's sort of a top-down view, like a serial program. Is there some distributed way? Is there some mechanism, some interaction besides competition, which could lead to the sort of combining of competitiveness and informativeness in the reproductive model of the evolutionary system? So that would retain the kind of flexibility and the kind of informativeness to drive the learning, and yet it would still drive towards things that were more competitive. And this started a study on the whole idea. Actually, I started getting upset when I realized that I had just essentially swallowed lock, stock, and barrel, and everyone, I think, who entered evolution, at least from Western society, kind of swallowed this whole, competition is the way of the universe thing, right? The whole dog eat dog, zero-sum world, right? So most games are zero-sum. I win, you lose, okay? But not all games are. You want to take a drink break? No? Okay. So, and in some sense, in evolutionary selection, where there's a finite set of, there's a finite carrying capacity of a particular niche, well, yeah, there has to be some competition for which creatures live in it, right? But that might not be the only thing that's there. So we started looking into this further, okay? Because like I said, what was happening in certain cases is that you would get subspecies that would essentially lock up everything and then stop making progress. Okay. Like a Nash equilibrium in the whole evolutionary space. Okay. You would get mediocre players who could wipe everybody else out before they had time to develop. Right? So this is essentially, this is our mindset, really. This is our Western philosophy, of laissez-faire, free trade, okay, creative destruction. How many people know all about this stuff? Free trade, creative destruction. Yeah, and von Neumann too. Huh? Well, he came up with Minimax, the game theory, 34, right? So, and Schumpeter is the we have to. They used him when they were talking about restructuring. Why everybody had to lose their jobs. Okay, because our economy is creatively destructive, and we have to destroy old industries in order to make room for the new ones and so forth. And the general idea that competition is good is something that we just take almost religiously as a given, right? At least in the West. In fact, Newt Gingrich's foundation is called the Wealth, Progress, and Freedom Foundation. But now I'm looking at something else. I'm saying I have this population of game players now, and I thought I wanted the best guy to play poker. But actually my goal is a little bit different. I want all the players to keep getting better and better and better at poker. It's a slightly different goal than find me the absolute best, right? And so what I started saying, well, there's two different roles here. It started coming out in the work. There are learners and there are teachers. Teachers and students. And the utility function for the teachers and students might not be the same. It might not be competitive. And in fact, what is the utility function for teachers? So, and that turned out, I couldn't find an answer to that question. In fact, I couldn't find anything since 1965 at the intersection of game theory and educational theory. It was very, very strange. It was like the whole economic literature and the educational theory literature just sundered at some point and never came back together. So So what we said is, well, let's just take a formal model, just a two-player game, a teacher and a student. And what is that game? How do we formulate that? So should students and teachers compete, like in a zero-sum situation? Yes, she thinks.
I think that's actually a classic example of a non-zero sum game.
Right, but what I'm saying is in evolution, if what we're thinking of is that there's a mechanism that could cause all the species to continue evolving, it might have to be a different function than a zero-sum function. And understanding it means that there's something besides competition going on. Okay? So, should teachers care about how good their students' grades are, or should they essentially, go to hit them with the hardest, most challenging stuff they can? Okay, like it's sort of a strange thing. When I came up with mediocre stable state, I actually taught at a major Big Ten university in computer science, and I taught the AI class for juniors, and it's my habit, I always make up new programming assignments when I teach a class. I don't reuse old ones, I always make up new ones. And these guys, they couldn't program their way out of a paper bag, and they're juniors, and they're going to go out into the insurance industry and the banking industry, and now we know what. Well, anyway, so I went out for pizza with them, and I said, so I don't get it. I mean, these problems weren't so hard. I could have done them as a freshman. What gives? And they said, well, Professor Jordan, they said, yours is the first class that we didn't have the answers. And I said, what? What do you mean you had the answers? Well, the other professors, they used the same problem again and again, and the fraternities all developed files, and so we can study the answers, and then we're not plagiarizing, but we can study them and write them in our own words. Okay? And I was an assistant professor, second year, and I went to the entire 45 computer science faculty, and I said, well, guys, we have a huge problem here. Okay? This is really bad. Said the students are cheating. They're storing the answers to the machine problems, and they're just regurgitating stuff and not really learning how to solve problems and how to be programmers. And I really think that we need to dedicate resources to revising our machine problems and making new ones for every class.
Which indicates that you're a second year professor.
Yes.
And why you're at Brandeis now.
Yeah, and anyway, so these guys are pretty fractious. The theory guys hate the AI guys, hate the programming language guys, hate the parallel and distributed guys. But they all agreed that I was completely wrong, and there was nothing wrong. Okay,
Consensus.
huh?
There was consensus.
There was consensus. Yeah, it's just it's too much work. Blah blah blah. We don't
There
want
was
to do.
a scientific consensus.
Huh?
There was a scientific consensus.
That's right. There was no problem. Okay. And I recognized this happening in the software several years later. Okay. Which was kind of weird. So now here's the model. Let's take, in evolution now, we're learning by playing a game, we can think of these as peers. And they're playing each other, and usually you think of it as competitive, but let's break that interaction apart and say, at one moment in time, I'm the teacher and you're the student. And in the next moment, you're the teacher and I'm the student. So we can look at the interaction between two peers of two species as essentially, we're both teaching each other and we're both each other's students. Right? So let's just look at half of that. Let's look at half of that. So just assume I'm the teacher and you're the student. Now, how do we define this game? So what I thought, okay, well, the teacher provides a problem to the student. Either a challenge in a game, or I'm in a sword fighting, I'm swinging my sword at a certain speed towards your neck. You can think of that as a challenge, right? Am I swinging it fast or slow, right? If I'm teaching how to play chess, do I do fool's mate in 4, or do I give you a little bit of time to develop your mid-game? So the teacher has a choice. The teacher's move in the game is to choose a problem. And we'll just simplify that to a number, D for difficulty, which say ranges from 0 to 1. Okay? Teacher chooses a particular difficulty problem, and the student, should they want to, tries to solve the problem, and then they get graded. And the student and the teacher both get a reward from, say, a central bank. Okay, this is the way these games work, right? You make your move, and then you get your reward or punishment. So how do you reward a student? Okay, well that's pretty easy. Okay, so if you get the answer right, you get a pass. If you get it wrong, you get a fail. And so students actually wouldn't care if the tests were all really easy as long as they got 100 on it, right? Because they just care about that passing grade or the A or whatever. But how do you reward the teacher? Was sort of the question, and I couldn't find anyone that actually asked it in that particular formal way. We just assume that teachers, even if they're underpaid, that they're doing it out of the goodness of the heart. There's some kind of altruism, you know, there's a socially, you know, people are committing professional career suicide so that the children of the society can grow up smart, right? I mean, we didn't ever really know, okay? So what I did is I said, okay, let's say we have 4 numbers. If I ask an easy question, the student gets it right, I get V. If I ask a hard question and the student gets it wrong, I get C. In other words, if you keep asking, you know, prove Fermat's last theorem, then the students will complain, and you'll get a very bad student evaluation, which can then affect your pay. Okay? Now, if I ask a hard question, what I think as a teacher is a hard question, you get it right. In other words, if I thought you couldn't do it, but you could, then you prove to me that you're learning, and I receive joy of being a good teacher. Okay? So that's J. And if I ask you something easy and you get it wrong, well, we don't know what that is. We'll call it remediate because I've learned something that I thought you knew, but you don't. Or at least I know you're not paying attention or something. So what should those numbers be? How much more time do I have?
Keep going.
Okay. So anyway, so to formalize the model, this is the first model that I did on this. The student doesn't learn, only the teacher learns. Okay? So basically, the teacher can pick a number, say a random teacher picks a random number between 0 and 1, gives it to the student, and the student flips a biased coin, and either gets the problem right or wrong. The harder the problem, the less likely it is the student gets it right. The easier the problem is, the more likely the student is to get it right. Okay? Now, given a student that's a sort of sigmoid curve like this neural network model, what kind of questions should a teacher ask to make this kind of student learn? And moreover, how do we reward the teacher for teaching the student the right way? So what we want, according to educational theory, is that the teacher should focus the difficulty of the problems right along the edge of the student's knowledge, the zone where they're, you know, lightly challenged, where they can prove their mastery, okay? And you ask them problems about where they're struggling. And if they get it right, they learn, and if they get it wrong, they might figure out why they got it wrong. But if you always ask them easy problems, or you always ask them killer problems, they're not going to learn as well. That's an educational theory that's handed down in multiple different ways. But how do we get a teacher whose self-interest it is to ask students questions in their zone of proximal development? So the teacher's utility is essentially, we take D, which is that real parameter between 0 and 1, and if the student's right, we get a linear interpolation between V and J, and if the student's wrong, we get one between R and C. So if you ask a hard problem and get it right, you'll get the J payoff. If you ask a half-hard problem, you get it right or wrong, you'll get the same payoff, and so forth. So what are the parameters for those 4 numbers? Actually, only 3 numbers, because one of them could be 0. Actually, only 2 numbers. But what are those parameters that would drive a teacher to be a good teacher? How do you pay and incentivize a teacher to be a good teacher? Even if the teacher is nothing more than, say, a hill climbing algorithm or a computer program. Okay. So our first assumption was that joy should be the highest payoff. Complaint should be the worst payoff. And then the other 2, well, you know, seeing that your kid can do 2 plus 2, maybe it's good for their self-esteem or something. You know, so we should get some payoff for that. And, well, since complaint is the worst, then remediation should be better than that. Now, what I did is I said, okay, take a teacher and make a hill climbing teacher that is essentially a probability distribution curve. And where does the teacher go? And it turns out that the teacher's maximum would be at around 0.25 under this payoff. So the teacher and the student, the teacher will essentially ask mostly easy questions in order to maximize their payoff under the 3, 5, 1, 0, which was my best guess because it's the same numbers as the prisoner's dilemma, which I thought were magical at the time.
The .25 is the
That's the-
average payoff?
No, the point 2.5, if you had a teacher that was simply looking for the difficulty task, the model is actually the teacher is a curve, and so the top of the curve is going to end up at 0.25.
So a teacher that just asks hard questions is going to get .25.
No, a teacher that asks 0.25 questions is going to get the highest payoff of a little over 3. Whereas a teacher that asks always hard questions is going to get a payoff closer to 0. Because the student can't answer them right?
So the teacher asks the average question, you get a payoff of .25. The hard ones.
No, I'm sorry, the max is not the teacher's payoff is on the vertical axis, okay? The max is essentially where the tangent goes to 0 on that curve, right? That is the place where if the teacher kept asking questions of this difficulty, they would be paid the most.
And what you're trying to get is a difficulty of 25.
Right, or in fact, when the student changes, I would like the teacher to change as well, okay? So then if we got rid of the complaint, so the teacher had no feedback, this is before grade inflation, okay? Teacher doesn't really care whether the student gets it right or wrong anymore, okay? And so they just, they get the biggest payoff from asking the hardest questions. They get teacher apathy, okay? Now what if the teacher's rewarded for the student passing? There are cases where teachers have been caught stealing things like the MCAS test so that they can tell their students how to get 100 on it, okay? And in England, actually, the people who write exams are different from the professors because they recognized a long time ago that if the professors write the exams and the students evaluate the professors, then the professors might write easy exams, right? So if you had cooperation, the teacher is paid for the student passing, for the student feeling good, and so they make the student feel good, but the student doesn't actually learn much, okay? And if the student and teacher are competing, we have the same problem. We have the teacher going to ask the hardest question. Learn to play chess from a chess master, and you're just beaten every single game, right? And you never get to learn how to play chess. You only learn how to lose. So what is the right thing? So we searched through this space using a fairly simple, simpler than a GA, using a brute force algorithm to look to see whether there are any payoffs that would cause the teacher to have the right kind of curve that would teach the student at their zone. And it turned out that we found one. In fact, we found a whole class of them where you pay the teacher for joy and for remediation, and you don't pay them for verification or complaint. And this looks like an edge detector in computer vision as well. But basically what happens is the teacher is looking for hard problems that the student can get right and trying to find the easy problems that foils the student. And both of those acts are essentially acts of finding information about the level that the student's at. And so you're essentially not only paying the teacher to be a good teacher, you're paying the teacher to do formative assessment of the student so that they know the difficulty of the questions to ask the student to maximize their learning. Okay? It's really kind of cool, I thought, when we found this. And so basically, in summary, when we thought we had peers learning in coevolution through survival of the fittest, we were doing that zero-sum winner-take-all structure, and things were getting stuck. And now we're building systems where essentially it's not happening. So what we wanted was that the teacher would ask harder and harder questions and drive the students to learn. But what we got, because the students and the teachers could share their payoffs, is we got easy questions, easy answers, which is essentially what GM gave Ford, right? Oh yeah, make a car better than the Skylark. Come on, oh no, wait, you make a car better than the Pinto, okay, right? I mean, it's crazy, right? You'd think. So anyway, so this essentially is, and we don't have the proof of it yet, but the teacher's dilemma at the level of individual interactions seems to be a candidate for a mechanism that will essentially balance the competitiveness and informativeness across the whole population without a central governor. But we haven't proved that yet. And then we have this new application that I'll tell you about. It's called B-Web. And like I said, the robots are not that active right now because I might as well do stem cell researches. I think that's my phone. They don't. I don't think I don't think phones are at least Blackberries, I don't think that they would pass FCC in this country. That's why they come from Canada. So what we did is we said, well, if we could take these peers and put them in a game, and instead of competing with each other, they essentially become each other's teachers. Well, we could scale this up peer-to-peer across the whole world on one laptop per child, and every kid would have their own teacher, a human teacher. Not a robot teacher, not an intelligent tutoring system, not a computer program, but an actual human teacher who would just be another kid somewhere else working across the internet with them. It was a really huge idea, okay? And so if we use this teacher's dilemma incentive structure, the idea is that we could take something that looks like an online game, Family Feud, or I don't know what online games you play, Sudoku, something, okay? But instead of trying to beat each other, the payoff in the game would be the result of this incentive structure that would turn the students to get the highest score in the video games. They would have to become good teachers to the person that they were playing with. That's the way you maximize your score. Okay? Not only getting your problem right, but also figuring out what the other guy knows and doesn't know and asking them an appropriately difficult problem. So I thought this solves this really 2,000-year-old economic problem, which is that it's called the 2 sigma problem. Has anyone ever heard of that? So this guy Benjamin Bloom in 1984 did definitive studies that showed that the smaller your class size is, from say 25 to 30 in the public schools, getting all the way down to 1 individual tutor to a student. If you make your class size smaller, the students' educational outcomes are better and better. And in fact, individually tutored kids are 2 standard deviations better than kids who learn in group instruction. And the problem is that no society can afford an individual teacher.
Can you extrapolate from that to having no teacher at all?
It's a very good question. It's a very good question. So anyway, so we've been working on this for a few years.
The Dalai Lama.
Huh?
I think the Dalai Lama got like, one-on-one.
One-on-one?
All of the royalty has one-on-one.
All the royalty.
Royally, yeah, at all times.
It didn't work for George Bush. Oh, he's not. I thought he was. Okay. Anyway, so the idea is that we take students across the internet and we put them in some what look like video games, multiplayer. I mean, we can go with fantasy schemes. We could. Right now, we're doing fairly simple games because you don't want to scare away the teachers. Okay. And the students essentially, without teacher supervision, will sit there and essentially cause each other to learn. And then you could apply this to a bunch of different structures. So the idea of this reciprocal peer tutoring, so to speak, is that in your role as a teacher, you create a problem for the other guy or gal, okay, and then you send it to them and they try to solve the problem, and then when they're done solving the problem, the teacher and the student both get paid. The student gets paid whether they get it right or wrong, 10 points if you get it right, okay. The teacher gets paid according to how difficult the problem was and whether or not the student got it right or wrong. So in order to do well in this video game, you have to get your own problems right. You have to work in a way cooperatively with the other students so that they give you problems that you can mostly solve, okay? Or you have to have a means of punishing the other guy if they're not doing it, right?
Who ranks difficulty?
So that is done by simple heuristic programs generally or by databases. Okay? So that's one way, and then we actually do it simultaneously. So there's 2 people in the game. They're both in a problem construction screen, so to speak. They construct the problem, or they pick it, or they pull it from a list, or they randomly generate it, however they get the problem. They get some indication of what their score will be and how difficult the problem is. They send it to their student. The student has a problem solution screen where they can work on solving the problem, either by typing in the answer, or by fooling around, taking measurements, or running slide rules, whatever the software can do. And then under a time limit, because it's a game and it has to keep moving, the answer is then graded by the computer, and the payoff structure is rewarded both to the teacher and the student, and the game goes on. Now, in the future, this could be completely real time. In other words, it could be that sword swinging at your head, and the way that you choose to swing the sword affects the difficulty of the problem you're giving to the other person. So this could become real-time multiplayer games, but for now, we're doing these kind of fairly trivial things because we're trying to, like I said, we're trying to not offend teachers. One of the things I found is if you try to teach computer programming, say, or genetics, or say synthetic biology, or artificial life, or AI, you try to teach something like that in elementary schools, You're trying to teach something the teachers don't know, and they just throw the program away. So it's sort of the whole idea of, taking leading edge science and getting it into curriculum is almost a worthless exercise because the people you're trying to sell it to don't want it. Okay, so you have to sort of get in there in stealth. So we developed a whole bunch of games that are completely non-remarkable in their subject matter, so that any teacher could look at it and say, "Oh, I see that that's going to be useful for my kids." Okay. What's really radical is that they're teaching each other without a teacher. Okay.
I want to figure that out.
They won't figure that out. That's right. So the first game is called Spell Bee, and the way that it works is that you choose, the computer generates a set of 7 random words, and we use the old Iowa data, which was a huge national study of difficulty of spelling, to do the difficulty in this game. You choose a problem and you send it to the other player, and they just have to spell it. And then you get a score for spelling your word right, and you get a score, which is if you give them finish and they spell it right, you'll get a 10. But if they spell it wrong, you'll get 0. So essentially, you're encouraged to think about what the other guy can spell, which you could look at their record or the last few rounds, and try to give them something that you'd get the most points whether they got it right or wrong. Okay? So if you give them an easy word and they get it